library that allows us to interact with our AWS services. Um, one thing to point out, like they're both kind of both like Terraform and Botto are like infrastructure as code tools. Um, Terraform mainly like is isn't going to like isn't going to actually take action with the resources, right? It just sets up the resources. So what I mean is like you can use Terraform to like create your EC2 instances, to like create, we'll see like a Lambda function, or create, like Redshift or Postgres, right? Some RDS instance. But in terms of like, or create maybe an Athena service even. But like in order to like trigger it, to write the query and trigger the query in Athena, that you're not going to do with Terraform, right? That you'll do with like the Botto library. So like one analogy I think I gave in a reading was like, Terraform is kind of like setting up the house, right? Setting up the infrastructure. Whereas you can imagine Botto is, it's exclusive. What's exclusive to it is like individuals in the house moving around, right? Actually like the action being taken once the infrastructure is set up. All right. So like you can use Botto actually for both, but like if you're using both Terraform and Botto, then that's how you'll separate out the roles, right? Like setting up the infrastructure and then taking action with it. And then in terms of what we started focusing on, right? It was Athena, and Athena is part of kind of like this serverless uh, mentality, or I don't know the right word for it, approach that AWS gives us, right? Which is like we don't have to always have a long running resource, something that's always like humming. Rather, right? Like that's what would occur if, say, we had an RDS instance up. It always has like a CPU allocated to it. We're always paying for that thing, right? With Athena, we can just basically pay per transaction, meaning pay per query, right? Another benefit of Athena is it can connect. So if we don't have something up and running the entire time, let me actually share my right. If you think of like if you think of RDS, well, it has both like the hard drive, the CPU, which is really the expensive part, and memory. I don't know how to draw memory. This is memory. So this is all three in that's supposed to be in RDS. Sorry. And then you can imagine what we have with Athena is you have S3. I can't draw. This is S3, right? And then you have a separate resource of Athena. Okay? And Athena, of course, is going to query S3. So what's nice about this is, right? And you can just draw our like CPU here. CPU. All right. So what's nice about this is like this guy, you're paying. This is always running, our RDS, and so you're always like paying for it. Now you want something like that, right? Like if you have like users coming to a website, that's very important because you don't want to have to like boot up an RDS instance every time another user comes to your website. Hopefully your website's a little more popular than that. But with something like Athena, if you're, say, making like data analytics queries, or these are like internal queries that you're making, well, then it's kind of okay maybe that Athena takes a second to boot up, run, connect to your S3 instance. Like maybe we're okay with that. And the benefit of that is that we don't always have to have this guy running, right? It's just going to be running per transaction. And instead, we'll always have data stored in S3, but this is not a lot of money, right? Having the occupying S3 storage is not a lot of money. Whereas, so you're separating out essentially like the query engine, right? This is the query I'm sorry, my handwriting sucks. This is the query engine. And then this is the storage. Thank you, Kyle. That is a good call. All right, so we're separating out, right, the query engine from the storage. And you're going to see this pattern like a lot. For instance, like Spark is a separate query engine. In fact, you can set Athena up with Spark, where again, it's just performing the queries, and this is the storage. Whereas here, it's all together, you know? Right? With our RDS, we're both querying and we're storing the data in one instance. Yeah, exactly. So Kyle says, this would be really great for like, a scraper. Yeah, and I agree, right? Like it's very nice. You need to store this data statically, and maybe you want to like query the data. It's also very useful, like when you're scraping down data, or you're like just storing a bunch of JSON or whatever in files, some of that data, maybe only a portion of that data is useful. So maybe you don't want to store all that in an RDS and have to pay for more and more storage here, right? Because you're also, as you expand the storage, you're expanding the CPUs. Maybe instead you just store all of it in S3, and then the relevant part, use Athena to find the relevant part, and then like the portions that are interesting that you store in RDS or something like that you move further down into your pipeline. Okay, so again, this is like kind of the idea is this is I don't know how this is like long running, right? And this is serverless. That word says serverless. Okay, so another thing that's serverless is like our Lambda functions. So if this is kind of like our long-running RDS, our long-running computer would be EC2. EC2. And it's the same thing. Like EC2, you're paying for the compute, obviously. It actually kind of looks like RDS technically is an EC2. It just has some configuration differences, but it's the same thing. You're paying for hard drive, you're paying for CPU, right? You're paying for memory. And this guy, just like the RDS, is always running, right? You're paying per month, okay? It's just always humming. Whereas Lambda function is, what it is it's technically like a long running, it's an existing CPU, but it's event-based. So what you can do is you can say like, you can trigger the event in multiple ways. It could be like when someone visits your website, like they make an HTTP request, that would be like an event. It's then going to allocate what's called like a VM for your function to run. And that function could be like, could be basically like a controller action. Like this was a GET request. We're going to now like connect to S3 or connect to my database, and send back some sort of response. It could be like, oh, we just got some other kind of event. So it could be HTTP. It could be someone uploads something to S3, which is actually what we'll be doing. So when somebody uploads something to S3, then we could maybe set up Athena, have the function, just have our Boto3 Athena code to like query the bucket and then store the output in like a separate S3 bucket, right? What's the benefit of this? Kind of like what I was saying, if we're storing a bunch of data in this bucket, like some of it's going to be useless, like not, we're just going to get back like data that we don't really need for our analytics. So we can like kind of think of like, querying this, get the relevant data. If you want to transform it a little bit, fine, but probably just get the relevant data and then store the relevant stuff in a separate S3 bucket. And this way we always have the original source data, but then we can like see our cleaned up subset, in a separate bucket, in a separate folder, etc. So it's like whenever somebody uploads something, whenever we see a new addition to our S3 bucket, trigger my Lambda function so that we then perform some transformations. And again, remember, like a benefit of this guy is that it's not always running, right? It's only when somebody triggers the function. We're then going to boot up a VM, on an EC2 instance that maybe some other teams also share, but we have our own separate kind of walled off portion that is going to boot up and then perform its action. Okay, so like that's a nice. It's a nice tool that teams use that's become pretty popular. Why? Because I give the analogy of like this over here is like renting a car, right? You're renting a car, and then this on this side is kind of like Uber or Lyft, right? Where you're just paying per use. So, I mean, the analogy really holds. It's like you might have to wait around to get this thing a little bit longer to get this thing up and running to actually get your Lyft, but you're only paying, per transaction as opposed to renting a car and always having each of these resources running. Okay, so we already saw like Athena, RDS, EC2, and like today we'll get to Lambda. All right. Cool. Questions before we're just going to now move into like implementing our Lambda functions and see how that works. All right, let's close this guy. Actually, it's a good idea, Kyle, but as soon as I already gotten me a stylus, I'm just this is a user issue. All right, so let's do the Lambda. Okay, so here's how you can get to them. You just literally type in Lambda. Okay, run code without thinking about servers, right? And now you can kind of see how it works. It's literally a function. You can write it in different languages. So here's a Python. And if it went, it would show you there it is. This is some Python. Return value. You can print to like the logs, etc. So let's click, I don't need that. Let's click create function. All right, and we'll do author from scratch. We'll do function name. So the function is sample function. Choose the runtime. Okay, so this is basically like, this like setting up an environment. So what do you want to install? Do you want it to be running on Node? We want it to be running on Python. Okay. The architecture here, you probably want it to mimic, like later on we'll move to actually deploying Docker images to our Lambda function, or booting up a container with them. So you just want this to, when we eventually use Docker, you'll probably want it to mimic your environment. I think I have ARM 64 because I have a Mac. And then we'll get to this later, right? Like, remember these roles, right? We have to kind of say, like, give our Lambda permissions to interact maybe with other services. Like, for example, if it's getting triggered by an S3, then our Lambda is going to need to be able to read from the S3 to detect any changes, things like that. But that was for another moment. For right now, we'll just do create function. All right. So you can see, right, like eventually we'll add a trigger. This is like what events, what events can call our function, and then what it like can connect to. We won't really need, I don't think, the destination. Maybe later on we might have a destination. And then you can see this is the function. All right. So it takes like an event and context. We'll get into the event soon. And like I said, we'll see, like right now we're just going to use some test events, but we'll see like the event can be, uploading an S3 file, and you'll get information about that event, which is kind of nice. And then it says here you can kind of put as much code as you want, right? This can be longer. You can even add additional files, things like that, from whatever, import other parts of your code, and then this just runs it. So you can think of this almost like that main, like we always have that run function, whatever. Like, so, if someone's saying like scrape data, yeah, you can like This is essentially like the run function. And you can have an extensive code base around here and just call run, Cool. So for now, this is fine. It says hello from Lambda. We'll just update a hello everyone. In order, if I do test right now, you're not going to see... Let me print something too. Okay, and then I'm going to save it. By the way, notice that this little gray thing is meaning it's not saved. If I press Command S, then you saw it turn green for a second. So there it's saved, just like in VS Code or something like that. Then you can create your own test events. So if I click on the right here, then you can see it says configure test event. It says create new event. Let's call my sample. It's fine, sample event. Template hello world. Here, this is fine. Key 1, value 1. This is just like a sample event. And by the way, you can like trigger your Lambda from Botto 3, so you can imagine sending an event to it, something like that. All right, so that's pretty good. And now let's call test. Test. So we just created an event. You can see it's there. If I call test, that will trigger the event. Okay. You can see it still says hello. So it did call an event. It says hello from Lambda. It's actually not exactly what we have, right? Like where's my print hola or hello from everyone Lambda? The issue is I didn't deploy my function. Right, so this is kind of like gives you that step of like committing or pushing your changes, right? So let's call deploy. You see it takes a second, updating the sample function. Now it's deployed to my environment. Now I'll call test again, right? And then this time it says hello from everyone Lambda. If you want to see a little bit more, which oftentimes you do, you can click on monitor and then click on, I think you'll see it actually at the bottom here. Oh, you liar. Let's click on it, view CloudWatch logs over here. So it just wasn't synced in this interface. We should see it down here. Maybe there's a way to refresh. But either way, you can just, that's a bummer. But either way, you can just click on view CloudWatch logs. And then I go to CloudWatch, and now down here, right, you can see the two different triggers. Remember I set up the one, and then I deployed, then I set up another one. You can see the timestamp, right? So this seems later, right, 31. So let's click on it. Here you can see the different steps. So I think the hola, that's what I logged, right? See my code. Go back to code. Click on the Lambda function, right? I did print hola. Right? So that's this right here. You don't see the return value, in the logs. Just like you don't see the return value, in like your like in your Flask code when someone makes a request. You just see, oftentimes you won't see the return value, you just see separate kind of like logs. If you want to, you can always just print it out or log it. But that's what I'm kind of doing here. Something that's useful sometimes to do is like you can print the event. Let's deploy that. So you can print the event itself, right? Or the other thing you can do is you can just access the event here in the return value. So you can imagine here I will do like event, right? So this, you can imagine that this Lambda function is going to get called because someone is like calling Lambda handler function and then passing through the event as well as some context. Okay? So if you want, we can print the event, we can print the context. This is the event, and then this is the context. All right, baby, context. Cool. All right, and then let's save it. And it says here, right, change is not deployed, so let's deploy it. And then let's trigger it. So that for that, we'll just click on this test, and remember, you can see where you're going to be using that sample event. So yeah, so this is now, right here you actually see the logs. That's kind of nice. So we printed the event. We see the context that we get. Just gives us a little bit of information, not too much because it is getting, it tells us like our Lambda function name, invoked function ARN, things like that. So those are all things, if you wanted to, you could reference, like for logging purposes, etc. Um, and then, ultimately you'll see like the the return value, I guess, as well. I'm not sure. It's just not logged for you. Yeah. So normally, these Lambda functions, what you'll do is you'll query, right? You can like query, and then if you remember with Athena, like if I query from the S3, then Athena will store the results in a separate bucket. So you kind of like see the results of your query there. I don't know otherwise if there's a way to see the return value. Let's try it one more time. Yeah, like you do see the response, right? And that's because, oh no, that's returning this execution results. Yeah, that's because of this status code 200, and then the body is my event itself, right? So you do see the response there. But I forget how maybe you can like hold on to that somehow. I'd have to look that up. All right, so this is kind of one thing. We're just kind of getting used to the Lambda function. You're saying it is just a function. You can imagine that it's called like this, right? Where the event is passed through and this context is passed through. The context is essentially just like some metadata, right? It has like the Lambda function ARN, things like that. And then we have this event as well. And then we can just like have what do we want to occur in here, right? Like we want it to query Athena. We want to, send back some data or whatever. All right, so what's next? The next thing that we can do is, I guess we'll create another function and we're going to add a trigger. All right, this is actually like a little bit complicated. Not that. It's just we have to worry about policies again. So here I'm going again, say I'm going to be using Python. Let's say this is my S3 trigger function. This doesn't matter for right now. You can use either one. And then this is what I'm going to have to do is create a new role with basic, I'll probably have to use an existing role. And to do that, we should have first create a role. I've already done it, but obviously you want to see how to do it. So let's do it. All right, so we'll go to AWS, sign in. I should go to sign in. Why do I have to create a role right here? Well, because I want this guy to be triggered from S3. So that means that I need to attach a policy, right? Attach a role to my Lambda function so that it can read from S3. Okay. So the first thing is click on IAM. Let's click on policies. We're going to create a new policy. Choose a service. We'll say Lambda. And now at this point, right, it's like trying to help us, but we don't want it. So instead, I just gave you the code to add. This is the statement you can add. And I'll walk through it in a second. If I can. Okay. All right. So let's take a look, right? This is the API version, right? This is just like the version of the JSON API. So that will always basically stay the same. Then it has these two different statements. And the first thing is, this logs that, like the CloudWatch logs that are tracking, right, logging everything that happens for Lambda. That's one kind of thing that's a separate service that Lambda needs to interact with. So we basically say, hey, I'll give you access to all the logs. And you get to put log events, create log events, create a log stream. Okay, so that's one policy or one statement. The other statement is only get access to anything in S3, right? So basically I'm going to allow you to detect and see an object that's uploaded to S3, right? The object is like your file that's uploaded to an S3 bucket. Then we'll click next. This is my policy. We'll say Lambda S3 access. You can see it's actually giving access to both of these services. Write access here, read access there. That's pretty descriptive. So we just created this policy. What's the next thing is we'll create a role. Click on create role, right? So all I did was go to roles right here, and I clicked on create role. And then we'll do service is Lambda, right? You can see it's right up top. Choose your use case. That's fine. Allows Lambda functions to call AWS services on your behalf. That's essentially right. And then we can just search for that policy. So right, we create a role as like a kind of like a user, and then we want to, what can that user do? And that's the policy, and you can see that it's exactly what we just did. Allow it to write to CloudWatch and allow it to view the objects. Select it, and then let's click next. And then we'll do Lambda S3 role or whatever, that's fine. And then let's click create role. All right, so I just created a new role called Lambda S3 role. The next step is I want to attach this role. So I should probably refresh this. And there it is, Lambda S3 role, right? I'll look at the advanced settings. This is kind of nice. Like you can see this, use function URLs to assign HTTPS endpoints to your Lambda function. So this is what I was talking about. Like you can make a request, right? You can basically set up an API that will trigger your Lambda function, which is pretty cool. Connect your function to a VPC to access private resources. We're not going to do any of this stuff, but just so you can see. Then we'll click create function. All right. So what we did so far is you can see like some of the information here. Like the runtime environment is Python. The handler, this is the function that's going to get called, lambda function.py, the lambda function. That's what's saying here. The handler is this is the lambda function module called the lambda function. I'm surprised I can't. I was looking for the policy stuff. Maybe it's under configuration. No. Permissions probably. Yeah. So here you can see the permissions. Oh, and here it is, the role, right? So I went to configuration, permissions, and you can see the role associated with the Lambda function. But we want to add a trigger, right? All we did so far is we just gave it permission to read from the S3, but we didn't actually add a trigger. So let's add a trigger. We're going to choose select source. So all I did, let me go back for a second. Here's my functions. Click on functions. S3 trigger function. Just click on this thing for add a trigger right here. All right, so add a trigger, select a source. We'll do S3. Okay, and now it's actually kind of a nice interface. It lets you choose one of your S3 buckets. All right, so for me, it's going to be this one, sample jigsaw 2 data, the beautifully named S3 bucket. I did it again. Let's do this. Click on S3. And then click on bucket, sample, jigsaw 2 data. Okay, so basically we're saying this is the bucket that serves as the event source. Okay, the bucket must be in the same region as the function. And the event type, select the events that you want to have trigger the Lambda function, right? You can optionally set a prefix or suffix for the event. For example, you can do something like, hey, only in this folder, images folder, right? If it's uploaded to this folder in the bucket, or only JPEG images, right? Here I just say all, at any time I upload anything. Here it tells me, hey, do not set up a recursive function. So what does this say? This says like, hey, if you are triggering a function that, or if you're setting up your Lambda function so that it's going to like get called every time you upload something, right, to your S3, don't make sure that functions, one of the things it does is not also upload something to the S3. Why? Because then it's going to keep calling itself and you're going to be billed a crap load of money, right? So like just right now all our function is going to do is like return some data, but you could call it so that it's going to like upload or do something to your S3 bucket, which will have it just continually get called like 1,000 times and bankrupt you. So an error occurred when creating the trigger. Configurations on the same bucket cannot share. I think the issue is I already have I might already have on the cannot share common event type. I think the issue is I already have a bucket, a Lambda function watching this bucket. So let's just create a new bucket real fast. Sorry about that. Create a bucket, general purpose, sample jigsaw 2 again. I don't think I need to enable public access, but I will, just in case. I acknowledge. Yeah, that's fine. And let's create bucket. This bucket again is called, I'll call it 3. And then create the bucket. All right, and now let's just go back to my trigger thing, and now let's change this, right? And I'll just click the refresh button, and it should be down there. There it is. All right, and now let's try this again. So I think, again, the issue is like I already had something watching this. Yeah, and that was the issue, that I already had a separate Lambda function watching the same bucket, so I just created a different bucket. And now this is kind of nice, actually, right? The fact that it shows S3 as the trigger, that's going to trigger my Lambda function, right? And then, yeah, you can always see the details of that, etc. Here's the code, right? So this is what's going to happen. Let's print out the event. Okay. And then let's deploy it. And now what should happen is if I upload something to that bucket, which is called sample jigsaw 3 again, and I'll upload our syllabus because we need to get some use out of it, and then upload it. Cool. All right. Let's see if anything happened. Click on monitor, right? And we can go to the CloudWatch logs. And it's 4:03 in my time. And right here it is, 4:03. Okay? So this triggered my Lambda function. Okay? And you can kind of see what happened. So here's my event, right? Remember I printed out the event. So this is what was logged. And here's the event. Event source AWS S3. So right, so what's kind of cool is like you can, just query that one file. Here's the object, the key, right? This is the syllabus that we uploaded. So you can use this information if you want to say like, all right, only search through the new information, like only query the new data, and see if there's something that happened there, right? Like you could imagine, like looking for specific events, like flight deals or something like that. Maybe you hit an API, save the data to S3, then you query the new data to see like, is there a flight deal? And if there is, like send it to this new bucket or whatever, or do some other thing. Send a notification through Slack or whatever, send an email, etc. All right. Cool. So what did we do? The main thing, we saw how we can kind of send test events, right, to this, right? You can still do that, create a test event, or just go back to the code and click, test, or configure test event, right? You can always do that. Here's the response, here's the logs, right? Or what we did was we also, in this case, we set up an S3 trigger, right? So that every time we upload something to S3, it calls this is the event that will call my Lambda function. And the way we did that was calling this add trigger, selecting the source as S3. And then from here, we chose our bucket, right? And we kind of said, what we want to actually trigger it, the object create events, etc. So that's what we did. Let me see, I think there's at least one question. Does a Lambda function have the capability to access, read AWS resources through code? Conwell, can you give me an example of what you're thinking about?
Yeah, so in the code we saw for the Lambda function, can we add code for accessing the AWS resources like we have been doing in our previous labs.
Yes.
Oh,
In fact, that's what the lab's going to be. You know what I mean? So it's going to be like, hey, the API, you can imagine like the API call gets called, and then what does that do? That calls Botto 3 to and Botto 3 will write the data to a bucket, and then let's say we have a trigger here that, that when it sees that something's added to that bucket, right? Then it's going to use Athena to query this bucket and write the result somewhere. Does that make sense? So
yes.
so you can I maybe not here in one of the assignments. I think it's this one. Let me see. Yeah, this. So you can see the lab. I kind of show you what we're going to be doing, right? So this is the lab is, right, something's uploaded to S3 in the Lambda function, right? You can put like import Botto, Botto client Athena, and then we can use Athena to query, like we just uploaded some JSON here. So now trigger the Lambda function. The Lambda function will query that bucket that just got updated to then look for whatever last three results or a great flight deal, and then the output Athena automatically writes the output to a separate bucket, right? When we set up Athena. So that's what the lab essentially is.
Hey Jeff, another quick question regarding this. So whatever we are able to access from this code over here, that is dependent on the policy, the role we
Yes,
associate with the Lambda.
that's true. So you're gonna have to, yeah, this gets into the lab, but like what you're gonna have to do is this Lambda function right now, if you go and you look at the permissions, configuration permissions, you can see it has access to like two resources. It doesn't really, oh, it should show you one other resource. Oh, yeah, it does. It has access to two resources, CloudWatch Logs and S3, but probably will need a third one, right? Like Athena. So you're gonna probably have to update the resources so that you also give it access to Athena. Cool. All right. So, in terms of what there's for you to do, you can look at this code walkthrough again if you want. Just remember like it kind of has these two steps: the extract and load, and then what we have, what you can imagine, what the lab will ask you to like set up, put in your Lambda function is the query bucket. Like, hey, once when something's uploaded here, maybe you'll need to like uh, query the bucket, read from the bucket. I don't know. Where is it? Query Athena. I think is it here? You get the query results. Yeah. So query the bucket with the query. So when we upload some data, you know, trigger your Lambda function to actually like select from Jigsaw or whatever. Okay. The lab will walk you through it, but that's essentially what you'll be doing. Is okay when we upload some data, then you'll trigger your Athena query, and then it'll write the results somewhere else. Uh, yeah, so we'll kind of, you'll get a review into that code base, and then, these two readings both walk you through what I just did, which is setting up AWS Lambda, and then calling that trigger event from S3, and then, here we'll do this Lambda Athena lab. All right, that's probably pretty good. If you want to look at EventBridge, that's where we're going next. So happy to deploy that reading if you finish early. Cool. Yeah, like I said, this is a very popular tool. It's one of those topics that we started teaching because it came up in internships a good amount. So we wanted to include it. All right, I will enable screen sharing.